Welcome to Dispatches, a production of the VVA Veteran Magazine and Vietnam Veterans of America, hosted by arts editor Marc Leepson. Each episode is a one-on-one interview with a writer, novelist, actor, director, or other artist whose work is influenced by the Vietnam War. In addition to appearing on the VVA Veterans Facebook page, archived episodes can be found on the magazine's webpage and on VVA's website. And now, let's begin.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 46 of Dispatches, a production of the VVA Veteran Magazine, coming to you live and on tape, as always, from Vietnam Veterans of America's national headquarters, right here in downtown Silver Spring, Maryland. Our special guest today is the former Boston Globe and Washington Post journalist and author Wil Haygood. Wil's 9 books include King of the Cats, The Life and Times of Adam Clayton Powell Jr., a 1993 New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and other award-winning titles. The Haygoods of Columbus, a family memoir in black and white, The Life of Sammy Davis Jr., and Showdown, Thurgood Marshall, and the Supreme Court nomination that changed America. Wil is best known for his best-selling 2013 biography, The Butler, the story of Eugene Allen, a longtime White House butler, which led to the popular Hollywood movie Lee Daniels' The Butler, based on Wil's Washington Post profile of Allen, and with an all-star cast, Forrest Whitaker, Oprah Winfrey, Vanessa Redgrave, Cuba Gooding. Today, we'll be discussing Wil's latest book, The War Within a War, The Black Struggle in Vietnam and at Home, which just came out, and in which he writes about how Black Americans experienced the Vietnam War and its aftermath during the waning days of Jim Crow in the South and the upheavals of the civil rights movement throughout the nation in the mid and late 1960s and into the 1970s. It's a terrific book. It's gotten great reviews. My review will appear in the March-April edition of the magazine. Wil, congratulations on the book and welcome to Dispatches.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here.
Let's just jump right in, Wil. Just before we get to the book, which we'll spend most of the time on today, I think people might want to know a little bit about, you were in top flight American newspapers, journalism. So first question is, growing up, did you want to be a reporter? Was journalism on your horizon? Or tell us about that, how you got into journalism.
Yes, no, I was actually the first person in my family to go off to college. So I really had no role models about what I might want to do in life. And I went to Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and I majored in urban studies. I thought I was going to go into city planning. And when I came out of college in 1976, I couldn't find a job, saved up a little money, moved to New York City, and ended up getting accepted into the executive training program at Macy's department store.
Oh, yeah.
So that's how my career started in retailing. And then one day, 2 years into that job, the store manager called me in and told me I wasn't ruthless enough to stay in retailing. And she asked me to write an essay about what I really wanted to do in life. Janet Moran, she is a friend of mine to this day because she sort of kicked me out of retailing. And I wrote an essay for her, handed it in, and she said, "Hey, this writing is so beautiful. You ought to go and become a writer. You really should, Wil. I mean, this is just absolutely haunting, beautiful. It's all about your hometown, how you came to New York City." And so, I thought maybe she had a point, and I started writing newspapers, and I got a job as a copy editor at the Charleston, West Virginia Gazette. And then I went to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, then the Boston Globe, and then the Washington Post. And now I write books full time.
Yeah.
That's kind of the short version of my career.
That's great. I mean, it's sort of the old-fashioned way, right? I mean, you started out with a small paper in a small town, and you wound up with 2 of the top newspapers in the country.
Yeah.
Tell me this, and I also love that part of the story where the manager took you aside and said, "Hey, kid, you're not good at this. What can you do?" Wow, that's really real. Does that happen in real life? Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, it does. I mean, she fired me, of course, and part of my essay was an effort to get my job back. of
Oh,
course.
yeah.
But she said, no, 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 no. You don't really want to do this. Well, it's not in your heart and soul. It's in mine. I can do it.
Right.
And because I'm sort of rough and tumble, but not you. And, and so she comes to my readings whenever I'm on the East Coast,
Nice.
and I always hug her and thank her for throwing me out of retelling.
That's it. All right. So real quickly, you work for these two great newspapers. Tell us a little bit, you don't have to go on too much, but what was it like, for instance, when you stepped into the Boston Globe newsroom and then when you hit the Washington Post?
Yeah, when I was at the Boston Globe, I started out as a feature writer. In Marc, it just so happens that 1984, the 20th anniversary of the Mississippi murders, the three murders, Mississippi, of Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner and James Chaney. And so I'm new to the staff and I'm sitting over there in the arts department. And I had the nerve to get up and go knock on the door of the national editor in 1984. And I said, do you know that the 20th anniversary of the Ku Klux Klan murders in Mississippi happened to be coming up next week? And he said, no, I hadn't thought about that. And I said, well, I went to college in Oxford, Ohio, and that's where the Freedom Summer Workers trained in 1964. And I just wanted to know if you were sending a reporter down there, and they might want to ask me about some of the landscape that I saw on the campus when I was there in the 70s. And he said, you know what? I think I might be looking at the reporter who I'm going to send out across the country to write a story about the 20th anniversary. So that was my first out of town reporting assignment. And it really was like something out of a movie.
Yeah.
Marc, it really was. I mean, I felt so proud to go get hotel room money, and then to head over to the travel office where I got a plane ticket. And I said to myself, whoa, I'm going on a plane for the Boston Globe. God dog it, I'm hitting the big time. And so from then on, I got chosen to do national stories. I guess that they liked the story that I had done. And then I was picked to do national stories. And then some years later, I'm still on the newspaper. They chose me to be a foreign correspondent, which is why, in a way, the Vietnam War was so fascinating to me to study. I've been in war zones. I was in Somalia, and I was in Liberia, and I was in South Africa. And so I've been shot at, fired at, etc. And I think thinking of that, it made me want to write this book. But anyway, 2003, I joined the Washington Post because they had been trying to get me for years. And I finally said, well, heck, I've been here at the Boston Globe for 17 years, and everybody talks about the Washington Post. So why don't you ride that horse? And so I hopped on and spent a wonderful 12 years at the Washington Post.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the book and the Vietnam War. And before I ask that question, how did the book come about? I wanted to talk about the opening chapter, which is set in 1967 in your hometown of Columbus.
Yeah.
And you talk about your neighborhood. And I'm guessing that since you started the book that way, that has an important impact on how the book came about. Could you just tell people in brief what the situation was in your neighborhood in Columbus in 67?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Marc, in 1967, I was 12 years old, and I was going to be soon turning 13. And so I was a young kid. And in the summer times, I would love to go to the playground you know, look at the teenage guys and sports games, you know, throwing horseshoes and softball. And I looked up to these guys. It was Larry Wilson, Jimmy Bolden, Charles Bowden, Robert Morris, Steve Collins, and Skip Dunn. They were all teenagers to me, but of course, that's a wide gap if you're 12 and 13 years old. And one day, Skip Dunn, one of those 6 guys, and they were all black, one of those 6 guys lived right across the street from me. And so there was a period for about 2 weeks when I hadn't seen Skip Dunn. And I worried about that because he always walked out of his house and waved at me. Hey, Wil, how you doing? He was a real wonderful soul. And so when I didn't see Skip Dunn for these 2 weeks, I asked my sister, I said, where's Skip? And because she had went to school with him, she said, Skip's gone to a place called Vietnam. And I said, wow. Didn't really know what it meant, had heard of Vietnam on the news shows and stuff. And later, Marc, I learned that 5 other guys from the neighborhood had also been sucked out of the neighborhood and sent to Vietnam. And I knew every one of them. I had a paper route, and I would throw papers up on their porches, and they all knew me. And so when I started doing this book, I looked back at that summer and I said, my goodness, the statistics show that proportionately more blacks than whites were sent to the Vietnam War in those first years. And my very neighborhood, personally, to me, showed that. And that, to me, was just haunting. Now, of those 6, 5 made it back from Vietnam. But here's something that's very fascinating. So the book had been finished, and I had written it, and wasn't going to talk about these 6 people at first. And one night, this is after the book is finished now, I'm lying in bed, and I woke up, startled awake. And I said to myself, I wonder whatever happened to Skip Dunn, the guy who lived right across the street from me, because my family moved to the east side of town in 1968, and I lost touch with Skip and his family. And so I made some phone calls back to my hometown and found out that Skip had passed away about 7 years ago. And I reached his widow, Miss Neva Dunn, and we're talking, and she had heard of me and stuff. And before I hung up, I said, Mrs. Dunn, for sentimental reasons, can I have a picture of Skip? And she said, oh, sure. I'll hunt one up for you and send it to you. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry that I won't be able to get the picture in the book because the book's all finished. And she said, oh, no worries, I understand. So anyway, the following day, she scans a photograph and sends it to me. And I was simply knocked out by the photograph. And then I sent it to New York to my editor. And my editor, Peter Gethers, he sends me a note and he says, hey, whoa. This photograph is so evocative, so haunting that we need to rethink, Wil, what we're going to put on the cover of the book. And I said, really? Are you thinking about putting Skip Dunn on the cover of the book? And he said, me and the art director, John Galt, are certainly thinking that. And lo and behold, this was, Marc, just some kind of kismet, just some kind of magic happening in the air. And he said, yes. And then they made the decision. They asked me to go back into the book and write about Skip some more. And so I changed the whole opening of the book. And this is Skip Dunn on the cover of the book.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a complete afterthought, and it was completely magical. It was one and the same. And I thought it was so touching that I wanted to fly home when I got the book jacket and show it to his widow and his family. And his widow had said to me, said, Will, maybe you can just drop one sentence into the book about Skip. His 7 brothers and sisters would be so happy, Will, just for one sentence, just for his name. And so her and I met and had a meal. But just before the meal started, I pulled out my, I had the photograph in the folder, and I said, Mrs. Dunn, I think I've done a little bit better than just one line in the book. And I showed her the book jacket, and she burst into tears, and we hugged, and it was very touching, very, very much so.
That's an amazing story. And when you were talking about it, and I realized that that it was Skip Dunn's picture, the first word that came to my mind was evocative also. That close up of his face, he's so young, so innocent,
Innocent is right, Mark. Innocent. Those eyes, he seems to be saying, like, I'm sitting here and I'm wearing a helmet that's too big and I gotta go fight in America. What have you got me into? My mother needs me back home. And it was so rich, that photograph. It haunts me every time I look at it because it's so real.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, what a story about how it came about. That's so good.
Yeah.
Let me talk a couple of broad questions or for you to elaborate on as far as the book is concerned. One is that you sort of focus on, what is it, 8 or 9 individuals who you interviewed extensively. Several of, and then you talk about a lot of other Black veterans of the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Or people who are associated with it in another way, like journalists. Tell me how, and several of them are well known, like Fred Cherry,
Yeah.
Air Force flyer, the POW, Joe Anderson,
Yeah.
fascinating guy from the Anderson platoon. That movie, amazing story.
It is.
And we're not going to tell people that. They're going to have to read the book to find out. But
good, yeah.
and also Wallace Terry,
Yes.
the great journalist, and who I was privileged to know and work with. Yeah, I mean, he's a great guy, and you do terrific work in bringing those all the sort of better well known. But then there's also the people who aren't that well known.
Right.
And so let me just ask you in a general sense. Is that what you were trying to do from the beginning? I mean, highlight people who are well known and then mix in, everyday people or people who did things that were extraordinary, but maybe weren't as in the public eye as, Fred Cherry or Wally Terry or Joe Anderson. How did you go about that?
Mark, you are exactly right. As a journalist, I knew I needed stories about certain veterans who had been written about, because you find veterans of today, and some of them never wrote down what happened, where they were, and it was the ones who had done something spectacular, medal-wise. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like Leroy Pitts.
Pitts, right.
He wins the Medal of Honor.
Right.
And so there's a lot written about him, and I could find his family members, and then they could share things with me too. And as far as the ones who weren't known, like there's a nurse named Dorothy Harris.
Yes.
Dorothy Harris from Cincinnati, not well known at all. But the more I talked to her, the more I knew she was going to rise in this story, because she knew Riley Pitts. And she was so haunted by him and what happened to him. I certainly won't, mention that. Folks have to buy the book to find out. But after the war, she was suffering. Mentally, she was suffering. And it was because of what happened to Riley Pitts in the war. So that mixture that mixture of known, unknown was really, really helpful to me
Yeah,
in
and
telling the story.
I was actually on my list. I was going to mention Dorothy Harris because she's a member of Vietnam Veterans of America. You mentioned that in the book,
Yeah, yeah,
and she was a nurse, Army
yep,
nurse
yep,
in the 12th evac, I think, in
yep,
Coochie.
yep.
And we at Vietnam Veterans of America, we're the our beginnings in 1978. We've had a National Women's Veterans Committee, so we've always been telling the story and helping women Vietnam War veterans. And I was really glad to see her story told in the book. And
Oh, thank you.
absolutely. Okay, two other quick things. Talking about, you just mentioned coming home. I think it's
Mhm.
pretty well known that Vietnam War veterans were not welcomed home. I call it a underwhelming reception.
Yep.
And I think that you handle that part well about the black veterans. And could you talk a little bit about that? I mean, all of us had to come back to this country that was divided, and divided over the war bitterly, all the politics. But tell us about African Americans' reception in addition to that. I mean, if
Yes.
you can
Yeah. Yeah.
generalize or tell some stories about that.
Yeah. One of the things, Mark, that I think people hardly ever talk about was under what conditions African American soldiers went to war. 1962, 1963, 1964, we had the first civil rights bill that had been passed in many, many years. And so they all were coming out of uh, hardcore, hardcore segregation in this country. And all of those young men who went to war from the South had known who Emmett Till was. They knew that Till was a 15-year-old kid in Money, Mississippi, who had been beaten and lynched because he allegedly whistled at a white woman in a store. So they all knew that because they were like, 10, 11, and 12 down in Georgia, Mississippi, Texas when Emmett Till was murdered. So you had that every black who went into the military was coming out of a country that had not granted them full equal rights. And so they go to war and there's this split screen. I'm at war, but still my mother and my father are still having a hard time trying to vote, and the cities are on fire now. When the black soldier, and this is very fascinating, when they flew back home, they, if they were in the South, if they were in the South, flying into an airport, especially in 68, 69, when the anti-war movement was, really starting to percolate. Uh, Southerners seem to be extremely proud of them at the airport. So they would keep on their uniform, walk proud, like I'm from the South and I've been pummeled and I've been called the N-word, but I fought for my country. That was some respect in the South. If you were getting off a plane in Seattle or San Francisco, or maybe Chicago, that black soldier is going to go into the bathroom and change out of his military uniform because he didn't want to be spat upon. And so I think for the black soldier, when they were coming back, they had to look around the landscape where they were, and they had to figure out, how will I be treated? Because Mark, as you know, many of the riots in the 1940s erupted after black soldiers had come back from World War II and was seen walking down the street with their friends, maybe who were white. There was nothing that infuriated whites in the South, in Washington, D.C. as well, than to see blacks walking proudly in their military uniforms. For some reason, that just set off spasms of violence. Just, you know what I mean? There was the famous case, and I know you've heard of it, of Isaac Woodard. Isaac Woodard was in World War II. He came home, he was on a bus, he was driving through South Carolina. He asked the bus driver to stop so he could use the men's room. The bus driver was upset with Isaac Woodard, who was a black soldier who had fought in World War II. And the bus driver called the local sheriff. The local sheriff came and arrested Isaac Woodard for no reason, took him to jail, and then took the butt of his pistol and gouged out his eye. And Harry Truman heard about that story, and he was appalled. He was appalled. Harry Truman, I mean, that was a big part of Harry Truman desegregating the armed forces. And so, you know, it's just the layer of history and that the black soldier had to deal with.
Yeah. I think you did a good job explaining that. And also, so the one other final point I wanted to make about that homecoming situation is, and we all know what it was like for us to come home. And we all know that there has been a disproportionate amount of, post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder among Vietnam War veterans. On the other hand, the story that sometimes doesn't get told is that, a majority somehow overcame. Now, post-traumatic stress is normal if you come from a war zone to peace. Post-traumatic stress disorder, that's a different story. But so, and I just wanted to, I took a quote out of your book because I think you illustrated that point that I just made well. And you said, not everyone woke up in cold sweats, wondering about Agent Orange and psychological wounds from the war. And then we went on and gave a picture of, a good handful of black veterans who adjusted well, had good lives, productive lives, and so on. So I want to thank you for doing that. And I'm glad you picked up on that part. So can you say a little bit about that? I mean, from your perspective, did you know that? I mean, did you know that going in, or did that idea that not everyone, had PTSD? Did you learn that doing the book? Yeah.
Yes, Mark, I learned that doing the book because several veterans wanted me to know that the best thing that ever happened to me was joining the Army or the Marines or the Coast Guard or the Navy. It was very possible that if you joined the armed forces, you could rise much quicker and higher than you could, say at a bank or at a firm. That there were opportunities in the military that were not available to you in civilian life. And so I really got a sense of that in spite of hardships because of race that many of these soldiers experience, they left the military with a deep love of country. But I think that's always, Mark, been important to the black soldier in this country. I mean, it was Frederick Douglass who went to Abraham Lincoln and said, look, the Union is in trouble and we need help. Please, sir, let black troops fight in this war. And word went out from the South that if you're Black and if you're fighting for the Union and if you're caught in the South, we will hang you by the neck in the woods. There will not be no prison camp for you to go to. You will just be hung by the neck. And 200,000 Black soldiers showed up with a death threat hanging over them to save the Union. And I think that is so powerful, and they said, I will fight for freedom. Give me the musket. Give me the musket. I will fight for freedom. I'll die for my country and I'll die for my family. It really gives me chills still.
100%. Yeah. Great. Well, this is great stuff. Great book. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Oh, thank you. I was honored. To hear from you. Thank you very much, sir.
Okay. Oh, wait. Don't call me sir, though.
Okay.
I was an EM.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Wil.
Thank you.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for watching, everyone. And thanks to the Dispatches team here at Vietnam Veterans of America's National Headquarters. Quentin Butcher, Alfie Williams, the indispensable Daniel Devora, Sean Venables, and myself. Dispatches was created by Michael Keating. And stay tuned soon for the next episode of Dispatches, a production of the VVA Veteran magazine.
Thank you so much, Mark. This was so, I'm always honored when I hear from somebody who was there, who likes the book, and because that means a lot, because I worked 4.5 years on it and I wanted to understand what happened. And so that was very important to me.